Ah, there you are.
Hi, Gordon. How are you?
Hi, I'm fine. How are you?
Good. Nice to see you again. It's been such a crazy past couple of weeks, so I didn't think too much about physics, but but I thought we'll continue with our conversation around the similar topics that we discussed. But
hmm
I mean we started talking about the nature of consciousness, and
Right.
uh, and I still kind of think that there might be, if there is something which allows everything else to exist, and there is a constant. It'll be very difficult to, or impossible to measure it, because if it permeates everything, then how can it be measured by something which contains that? Does that make sense?
Yes, I mean, you could say that within the concepts of physical science and in the concepts of biological science, which is almost a physical science, and in at least some concepts of psychology and some concepts of sociology, the term energy is used extremely broadly. So that of all the concepts that I can think of right now that science makes use of, I think you could make an argument that what we call energy, and by we I mean all the different branches of science, what we call energy, if there is any common element in all those different concepts that are called energy in the different fields, that might be a decent candidate for something that is absolutely pervasive and everywhere. And within the physical sciences, we embrace the principle of the conservation of energy. But that's already under a strain or a tension in general theory of relativity, where it turns out that while you can define the total energy of an isolated part of the universe, it's extremely hard to even define the concept of total energy for the universe as a whole. In general, there are some special models of the universe that allow the concept to be defined, but for a completely general universe governed by general relativity, the concept of the total energy of the universe is very elusive. But notwithstanding that, I think energy might be a candidate for this pervasive stuff. And if it is a reasonable candidate, then one can talk about how much energy is over here and how much energy is over there and how much energy is in the psychology of a given individual and how much energy is in the psychology of another individual or in a biological species or in another biological species. So you might be able to measure this pervasive stuff, notwithstanding its being pervasive, by simply measuring the contrast of the concentrations of this stuff in one species versus another, in one location versus another, in one society versus another. I don't know. I think that might be doable.
It's a really interesting concept, because I mean, the concept of energy also pops up in alternative medicine. They
Yes.
call it qi, which is in Chinese it means energy, and so is that, and they do kind of I think concepts in acupuncture and things like that is also kind of
Right.
tapping into those energy points in the body, and like unblocking any energy blockages around the body. So do you think that's all? Is it scientific enough to talk about those things? Like, I mean, it
Well,
just
that's a very interesting question. And when I talk to most of the people I know who are inclined to refer to those kinds of concepts, I usually adopt a rather skeptical tone because my experience is that it seems to me that people who champion those ideas tend not to champion them from a skeptical perspective in which they want to render the concept more precise, more susceptible to quantitative expression, more susceptible to challenging whether you can do this or that with this modified concept of energy. And so I adopt a skeptical mode. On the other hand, talking with you about these matters, I feel differently, because I have the impression that you are a skeptical and careful thinker and are very interested in the possibility that these concepts may have something relevant to say about pervasive stuff, but you recognize that we have to be careful with those concepts. We can't just run amok, so to speak, and say everything is key, and feel that we have explained anything.
Absolutely. I think skepticism is healthy.
Oh yeah, I think there is that possibility.
So and does that mean, like, I spoke to you about trying to understand everything, including human behavior, from very fundamental concepts in nature, universal concepts. Like, I mean, the mind itself, like, how do we define mind? I mean, in psychology, mind is described very differently to physics, to philosophy, to neuroscience. And is mind energy, or is mind, what is that stuff? Like, so that's...
Yeah. On one hand, I feel that the current state of science, and again, I'm including all of the different branches of human inquiry that would characterize themselves as science, even though there might be skepticism from one branch to another. I think it's safe to say that at the present state of science, we are very far from understanding what you have just suggested. But my guess is, and it's only a guess, is that the time will come when gradually we will progress towards more and more understanding. And if and when that happens, and this could be sufficiently far in the future so that we even have to ask whether by that time the human species still exists, or has it evolved into something with even more analytical powers and intuitive powers than we can conceive of? That's a possibility. So, let's see, I've lost my train of thought.
Sorry, I'm not helping much because I'm talking about so many different topics as well.
Well, that's okay. You're listening to me go on and on. So I have to catch the train of thought again. Okay, so yes, I think we're a long way away from that kind of understanding, but I do think eventually it will come, at least in part. And my guess is that when it does, there will be a lot more unification that will have taken place between the physical sciences, the biological sciences, the psychological sciences, the sociological sciences, and we may have abandoned by that time the idea, which is still rather prevalent, that physics is somehow the fundamental science, and everything builds on physics. We may have had to relax that position. I wouldn't be a bit surprised if we did. I do still think, and this will expose a prejudice of mine. I do still think that science will be grounded in quantitative mathematical analysis, because I see quantitative mathematical analysis as it's our capacity to speak and to think in the most precise way we can. And I personally can't conceive of how we could do that, how we could match the level of precision that we have in mathematical applications to the real world in any other way. The mathematicians frequently cast scorn on the flippant way that scientists use mathematics, and the philosophers claim that they can be just as precise without mathematics as the mathematicians are with mathematics. I'm skeptical of those attitudes. I think the philosophers are not as precise as they think they are often, and I think the mathematicians don't recognize the power of intuitive applications of mathematics. They recognize it after the fact. I mean, intuitive applications come online, somebody's done something remarkable, the mathematicians will cast scorn on it because it's not rigorous, but then after they make it rigorous, which they invariably, inevitably do, then they recognize how powerful it was in the first place. And I think that will continue. That's my prejudice about mathematics. The only person I know of who is more oriented towards mathematics as a kind of panacea than I am is the physicist Max Tegmark at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, who frequently argues that mathematics is everything, that everything is mathematics, and there is no such thing as clear concepts or precise theories except in the context of mathematics. And I'm not quite prepared to go there yet, but maybe I will be someday.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I think I agree that mathematics is probably the most precise science, and nothing can really match it.
Right.
I guess one question I have is the mathematics that we have today might be describing in precise terms what we experience our own universe. So I am making some assumptions that maybe there are alternative universes, and that's again another theory which may
Right.
have a very different set of laws, physical laws, and
Yep.
mathematical descriptions of them. So although the mathematics can be very precise in describing our reality or our own reality, it would probably be very different somewhere else.
Yes, I think that's correct. I mean, it would probably at least be as different as the mathematics of today is compared to the mathematics of the early 18th century. I mean, we can recognize the mathematics of the early 18th century and remark on how clever those guys were, like Leonhard Euler especially, probably the most brilliant mathematician of the 18th century. And we can recognize that, but one could make a case that it would be extremely difficult for the mathematicians of those days to recognize some of the stuff we do today as even being mathematics. You know, you're playing some kind of weird game and I don't get it. What's the rules? And so on and so forth. So I suspect, yes, that in the far future or in some alternative universe, if there is more than one, what counts as mathematics, what counts as the symbolic language with which one achieves high precision and plays the role of mathematics, would strike us as something incredibly bizarre, and we wouldn't be inclined to call it mathematics at all. Yeah.
Yeah. So now, kind of diverting from that a little bit, can mathematics describe consciousness?
Can mathematics do what?
Describe or explain consciousness, like.
Yeah. my answer, which is strictly a guess, would be not by itself. What one needs, and this I take from my understanding of the history of science, because I think this is applicable in every instance of the history of science making an advance. What one needs first and foremost are qualitative, intuitive conjectures that are corroborated by observation. And the observations initially are themselves qualitative, approximate, not terribly precise. So you have these qualitative, intuitive conjectures, and gradually, in the struggle to make them more clear, more precise, more broadly applicable, gradually one comes to quantify them, which doesn't mean to render them completely nothing but quantification, but merely to augment the intuitive conjectures with quantification and then with mathematics. So I don't think it would ever be the case that one could justifiably say that mathematics describes consciousness. But mathematics can render precise any intuitive, qualitative description that we mount that is at all successful. Mathematics then comes to play the role of rendering our ideas, whatever they are, more precise. But by itself, it can't do that. It can't do anything like that, absolutely. I don't think.
And a few years ago, I came across a book called Purposeful Systems, and it's by Russell Ackoff. I'm not sure if you've come across that name. He was a systems thinker.
The title sounds a little familiar to me, yeah, but I haven't seen the book.
He was a systems thinker, and so introduced on the concepts of systems dynamics back in the 50s.
Right.
But he had this book called Purposeful Systems, and he attempted to describe all human behavior in mathematical terms. And I found that really fascinating, that everything, all like from emotions, intentions, motivations, and all of these things were very elegantly kind of described in mathematical terms. And I found that very fascinating that we could do that. And I guess that was probably the closest thing I have seen human, like, or social sciences and mathematics. There was that bridge which was attempting to describe all kinds of behavior, but not just behavior in an individual, but how behavior is impacted or influenced by in a system, which is a society, which is like, and that was quite fascinating. And I mean, I haven't had a chance to go deeper with that, but that was kind of going through the book and seeing all these different equations describing emotions and behaviors. I was quite
right. That sounds quite interesting. Yeah, I haven't come across that book, but I think books that are somewhat related to what you're talking about that I have come across are, among other things, some books on fuzzy logic and the use of what is called fuzzy logic in the development of artificial intelligence systems. Mm-hmm. And this fuzzy logic, notwithstanding the fact that it's fuzzy and still called logic, it itself can be rendered precise in the sense that the fuzzy logic satisfies precise rules of manipulation and combination, as ordinary logic. They're different rules, and the difference is what makes the fuzzy logic different from standard classical logic. But the rules themselves are still precise. And apparently, when you're trying to build a system, a purely physical, non-living system that is capable of learning, it's far superior to not try to program exactly how the system will learn. You have to put the system together in such a way that it is free to randomly search, in effect, for the best way to learn. And the machine can do that on its own. And it gives rise, in my mind, to the question, all right, suppose we do that better and better and better and better. At what point does it make sense to contemplate the possibility that such a machine would become conscious, would become self-conscious? And that refers to my preference for the idea that consciousness isn't in some sense always there everywhere in every nook and cranny of existence, but rather under the right circumstances, it comes into existence, which does require that one has to believe that in some sense something can come from nothing. And I guess I am a supporter of that idea. Not energy, which is presumably conserved, but energy, pervasive, conserved energy of the most primitive type, under the appropriate circumstances, could itself evolve into energy of a more sophisticated type, if that makes any sense at all. Yeah.
Wow, I'm just trying to absorb that right
now. Don't work too hard at it.
Oh, that's wonderful.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think that's one of the fascinations I have is that consciousness does it come from, is it emergent, is it an emergent property that
right.
It's as you said, if we create very sophisticated artificial intelligence and at some point they reach a point of self-awareness or consciousness,
yes.
then that's what it is. It's a more it's an evolved. It's just like intelligence, basically intelligence, and then intelligence becomes more sophisticated, and at some point it develops self-awareness. So that certainly makes sense.
Yeah.
Whereas I think what I mentioned to you last session was that whether the possibility of consciousness just being there and kind of latching onto. An intelligence that becomes sophisticated to be able to pick up on that, right? So,
right.
Now, that's the thing.
I certainly wouldn't argue that is impossible. I mean, it's entirely possible that consciousness is there from the beginning, everywhere, just waiting for the right circumstances to latch on to some physical substratum and become a conscious living organism. It's just, so I regard that as possible. It's just that somehow, because of my particular combination of prejudices and persuasions, somehow the emergent idea that consciousness comes into existence on the right circumstances, it just appeals to me more.
Mm-hmm.
But who knows how it goes.
And I very much admire your, a lot of people in society feel that a lot of things are set in concrete and especially physical sciences, and they don't realize that. And what I admire about your perspective is that you view everything as probabilistic, and I wish. And I wish we all, like as a society, as a collective, we're like that, because most people feel that they know the truth and they kind of set in stone as like, whether it's from a religious perspective or whether it's from a scientific perspective or philosophical perspective. And to go above that and to always be able to question the validity of beliefs and perspectives is the most powerful tool I think we have with us today, and it can really transform our societies if people kind of start being like that. It doesn't make people. I think people find stability, or they ground themselves in that belief system, and they feel safe. But unfortunately, that causes so many problems in society. That
it does indeed. It does indeed. Yeah, we need a book with a title like "How to Love Probability."
No, absolutely, and it's interesting because it is possible to feel comfortable in uncertainty, like to find
Yeah.
comfort in not being able to be certain about what reality is, and I think
Yes.
you and I, we both share that kind of sense of stability in uncertainty, that we can question our own judgments and our perspectives. But many people, and I don't know what causes it, but many people find that very discomforting, and so they avoid that. Um,
Yes. I don't know this, but I wouldn't be surprised if that tendency you speak of, which is certainly very prevalent, is correlated with the difficulties, the level of difficulties that people have had in their lives as they see them. If they've been frequently beaten down, frequently have had to give up on desires or aspirations, that might make them more susceptible to a dependence on certainty and grasping at the straws of certainty whenever they feel they can. Uh, yeah, it's unfortunate.
yeah, and I
Mm.
think you're absolutely right. I think there is a psychological component to that, and I think there's potentially a cultural component to that as well. And
Yes,
some cultures are more comfortable with uncertainty than other cultures. Uh,
right.
and and but inherently, we see this, and we see this in politics as well. People who will rise up to politics, and they're very uh, certain about what is right and what is wrong, and black and white tend to
Yeah,
draw more attention and popularity, because it creates this level of certainty for people that they, okay, and if you look at it historically, and it's been that way. I mean, if someone is wise enough to come and say, hey, look, we don't actually know this, then people kind of start freaking out. It's like,
right,
how could you not know? I
right,
mean,
right, right. Yes.
and that's why I think I want to quote uh, Russell. He mentioned that the difference between the problem with the world is that the the wise are so uncertain of themselves, and the fools are so certain of I can't quite recall the actual word, but um, um, yeah, no, I'm going to Google this up for you. Sorry, because it's such a nice quote.
This is Bertrand Russell you're speaking of,
Bertrand
yes?
Russell, yes.
Right. Yes.
I will find that for you right now. The power of Google. Um, so okay, here it is. So the whole problem with the world is that the fools and fanatics are always so certain of themselves, and the wiser people so full of doubt.
Right. Yes.
And that, unfortunately, is I think it's the case because a lot of people are drawn to
Yeah.
what they think is certain, but often very wrong. And historically,
Yes. Yes.
and that's why people get
Yes.
drawn to
And
religion as
things
well.
are especially dire when such individuals or individuals who are extreme in this sense of certainty rise to the level of leadership of entire nation states. And right now we're in the midst of a large number of such people. I mean, Trump and Bolsonaro and in Brazil and other. It's really amazing the
Absolutely, yeah.
accession to power of people who grasp at an authoritarian rigidity. Yeah,
Yeah, absolutely. And
sad
it's
to
a
say.
global problem, absolutely, and
Yeah,
it hasn't changed since the early 1900s. I mean, we haven't essentially um, we've advanced so much in technology, and we think we have evolved, but I think people's mentality and attitude hasn't really changed all that much. They're still susceptible to very similar mistakes that were made
Yeah, I agree.
in the in the previous World War One, two, and with the rise of
Yes.
Hitler and so on. I mean, still people are susceptible to very, very similar kind of challenges.
Yes.
So the rise
Yeah.
of consciousness we talk about is actually becoming aware of that we don't know anything's
Yeah.
and not to be attached to certainty, like so I think that is quite fundamental for us to recognize that our perceptions can be wrong.
Yeah. In the book club, I guess we haven't maybe talked about that, but you saw me talking with my friend Tom in Webster's.
Mhm.
And Tom and I both belong to a book club that meets on Tuesday mornings. And these days we're doing the meetings through Zoom. And there's been a lot of discussion recently, partly because of the book we're reading, about consciousness. And there are a number of people in the group. The group is about 12 people. It's about that size. And there are a number of people in the group who keep emphasizing the distinction between consciousness and self-consciousness, and the arguments that can be made for the existence of a large number of species of living organisms that are conscious of their environment but are not self-conscious. And the argument comes up repeatedly as to just how to characterize the difference between consciousness and self-consciousness, and just how large a change is that. Is self-consciousness just a matter of adding one item to consciousness, namely adding the self to the panorama of things one is conscious of? Or is it a deeper, more profound difference than that? And nobody has any good arguments to answer this question, but the question keeps coming up.
Wow. Absolutely. Like, I think we kind of touched on that last time when we were talking about, like, for instance, trees and shrubs and some plants which respond to their environment. So obviously they have some awareness. But whether they actually have self-awareness, that's another story.
Yeah. Well, there are things like if you take chimpanzees, they can, under the right circumstances, they seem to be able to recognize their image in a mirror. And so that indicates some level of self-consciousness. And some other mammalian species, people argue about whether cats can do that, whether dogs can do that. Sometimes they behave as though they can. A cat can paw at an image in a mirror, but it's not clear that the cat is recognizing that image as being itself, as opposed to just being another cat. It's very hard to tell. And then when you get down to the level of plants, there are people who argue for the consciousness of plants, and there are others who are very skeptical of that, because it seems that everything that plants do have the character of just a response to the environment. Something changes in the environment and the plant responds. Plants tend not to initiate. Even if you talk about a plant that is carnivorous and eats insects, it only does that when the insect disturbs some extension of the plant inside, like these various plants that when an insect gets inside it, the plant goes like that and traps the insect. But the plant has to be triggered to do that by the insect landing inside the pod. So anyhow, there are lots of fascinating questions there about all the different levels and kinds of awareness that various living organisms have to their environment, and when and where does the transition occur from an organism or species of organisms that are not aware of themselves to organisms that are aware of themselves. And I don't have any good feeling for how much research is going on in a question like that, but I suspect there is some.
Mm. I'd like to go back to your earlier analogy of artificial intelligence,
Mm-hmm.
and how it may evolve to become conscious or self-aware.
Right. Yes. Yes.
Um, Now, let's say that does happen. That's so artificial intelligence continues to evolve to a point where it can identify that it's a separate entity from its environment, and it requires to protect itself or survive. And that's
Yes.
what is kind of inherently with. I mean, animals do that anyway. Like animals
Yes.
are trying to survive by hunting and protecting themselves and their
Right.
tribes
Right.
and their herds. But in terms of if we have a rise in consciousness in an artificial sense, could we say that's an emergent property, or could we also say that a system needs to become complex enough to be able to pick up on that pervasive consciousness that there is?
Yes. If the pervasive consciousness does exist prior to being exploited by a particular organism, species, machine, but then becomes exploited by that organism, species, or machine once a certain level of sophistication of internal structure is passed, is crossed. Yeah, that's a conceivable scheme. That's as far as I can tell. I see nothing wrong with that. Um, and one question that arises is, okay, there's that possible scheme. There's also the possible scheme that the consciousness comes into existence once this critical sophistication level is crossed, and that it didn't exist before that. How, observationally, could you distinguish between these two theories?
Yeah.
Right off the top of my head, I'm not at all sure.
Mm.
And yeah, that would require a good bit of thought. I don't know how you would distinguish between the 2
Mm-hmm. I'd like to also talk about the concepts of entanglement and things which
Yeah.
particles that are entangled in and can be changed in space and time.
Right.
So there does seem to be some like a deep interconnected reality that is there, which reflects that things are not in reality things are not working independent of each other. There is some kind of a deeper interconnectedness
Yes.
there, and one issue with self-awareness or self-consciousness is the illusion of separation, that I am a separate entity, and I am like everything else is separate to me, and I can use resources to survive.
Right.
And it almost seems that perception that arises from self-awareness is actually deceptive, and it makes a self-aware entity to not be able to recognize the interdependencies that exist between it and its environment. And that's
Right.
one of the challenges we're having today with the current situation with the coronavirus is people still feel that it's people don't realize it's not about them, it's about the whole of society and how we are impacting all of us, our behaviors
Right.
impacting all of us, and
Yeah.
that's exactly what's happened. It's been just a few people who have infected close to 1 million people right now, and it will continue
Yeah.
to rise. So all the self-awareness, it seems like a more evolved version of an organism kind of get to a point where we can consider it as a step up to just being aware of its environment. But maybe it is not the highest level. Maybe there are high levels of awareness and consciousness to make those entities realize the interdependencies and interconnectedness of reality. And I know I kind of mentioned entanglement, but entanglement is just one reflection of how particles can be connected across space and time, and this kind of and our perception of separation is like, if I look at another person or another tree, I see a separation in space, but that could just very much be an elusive separation in itself.
Yeah. So that's very interesting, because there are a lot of ideas being kicked around in foundational physics these days. They're not established by any means, but that quantum mechanical entanglement, instead of just being a very bizarre, from our ordinary perspective, a very bizarre feature of quantum mechanics, perhaps it's a much more fundamental feature, which is constituting the ground for many of our ordinary concepts, such as spatial distance, etc. And the one qualification that always occurs to me concerning that is that so long as one is talking about human beings or other organisms that are confined to this planet, and strictly speaking, they're the only organisms we really know are alive. I mean, it may be, and I suspect that life is prevalent throughout the universe, but we don't really know that yet. And if you confine yourself to life, and in particular human life, on this planet, there's a sense in which one doesn't need to resort to quantum mechanical entanglement to have reasonable conjectures for the kind of interconnectedness that we can possess but tend to ignore or tend to doubt. And the reason is simply that electromagnetic radiation propagates so fast that we can have electromagnetic interconnectedness from one point on the globe to the opposite diametric point on the globe in tiny, tiny, tiny fractions of a second. So any kind of interconnectedness that we may experience as a consequence of consciousness, conscious awareness, if it has a physically based explanation, it probably only requires electromagnetism to provide that explanation. Quantum mechanical entanglement might make a difference if we were talking about interconnectedness between ourselves and advanced living organisms in the constellation of Andromeda or something like that. For that, we might need something faster than electromagnetism.
Yeah, absolutely.
But for here on Earth, electromagnetism would suffice.
I think that's and just that realization. I think that's probably the next level of awareness is of the interdependency and interconnectedness of the self-conscious entity and the broader environment that they live in. And so I mean, if you look at historically in terms of the early humans. And early humans had smaller tribes, but they were also about survival of the smaller tribes, and there was probably wars against other tribes to survive and to be able to have access to resources. And by the looks of it, Homo sapiens were quite competitive in terms of compared to the other human species, and that's why the others got extinct and the Homo sapiens were
probably yes.
So it seems that's the case. But now, kind of in recent times, we have a kind of consciousness which is about. It's not about the individual survival or the tribe or even a nation. It's all about the holistic survival of all humanity and in fact all creatures that are living on the planet.
Yes.
and that's
Yeah.
that kind of I guess that kind of idea couldn't have existed for the early humans. I mean, they would not have been able to
That's
see
right.
the world that way. Um,
Yeah.
so would it mean? I mean, if you think about evolution, does that mean that kind of that level of awareness of um, someone kind of being able to empathize with all the others human beings and all the creatures around you, and not seeing that one has more value than another, and just wanting that kind of level of um, 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 well-being for all the thing, all the creatures. Is that kind of, could we say that, I mean, is that a more heightened level of awareness than just self-awareness? Could we call it that, a more evolved version of awareness?
Yeah, that's interesting. My guess, right offhand, is that among psychology theorists of the early 20th century, I would think Carl Gustav Jung would have a lot to say about that kind of thing, and in a positive way. He would argue for the existence of a culture-wide consciousness and a culture-wide mind that, to varying degrees, the individual members of society tap into, depending upon their talents for that sort of thing, depending upon their inclinations for that sort of thing, depending upon their belief structures and the dogmas that they subscribe to. But different people actually make use of that. Now, my understanding of the attitudes of many contemporary psychologists is that they're very skeptical today of the theories of Jung and even to some extent of the theories of Freud. But there have been aspects about Jung's theorizing on those topics that have held some appeal for me. So it strikes me that could well be the case. Um, and there are certain people who seem to quite spontaneously have more empathy for others than most people do. And it doesn't even take the form, in some of the cases that I'm thinking of, it doesn't take the form of theorizing about it and therefore being empathic. It's just a spontaneous reaction they have. It's built into them very deeply. And that could be a manifestation of the kind of thing you're talking about.
Absolutely, I think that's a great example, because a lot of times people can have empathy when they can relate to someone else. Like, for instance, they can find some kind of common ground, or they theorize in their mind whether that person deserves empathy. So they kind of, but there's a cognitive process to reach that level.
Yes.
Whereas what you're saying is a
Yeah.
spontaneous feeling of, I would say, maybe love towards something which maybe there is no direct relation, or what it is. It's kind of, for instance, someone might see another human being or an animal or something, but then they recognize there is life, or there is something which is intrinsically the same in
Yes.
that
Yeah.
creature and themselves, and then they kind of, that spontaneous empathy kind of arises from that.
Yes.
And also kind of going even higher to levels of individuals who sacrifice themselves for others.
Right.
We
Right.
look at some of our some of our leaders and historical figures that kind of, even death, they could actually not even worry about death, right? They had this kind
Right.
of mission for a greater good, or greater belief that they had. So that's interesting, because it's not when we look at that, it's not about survival. It's not about an individual or self-aware entity trying to survive. It's really about something beyond that. And
Right.
So it
Now, it is the case that some biological determinists will say, and these arguments still creep up, crop up, I should say, that when one member of a species sacrifices itself for what appears to be the common good, they are doing what is biologically required in order to preserve the species. And that biological evolution is oriented more towards preserving the species than it is towards preserving the individual organism.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I've heard that argument. Yeah, that makes sense. Biologically. It's
yes, but we are not determinists.
Well, that's one of the things. It's kind of I've even forgotten where I stand with these kind of
right.
Because I kind of switch. I mean, and that's the thing. That's the uncertainty I have, and just I guess it's what is reality, and that's all that matters. Like, you know, if tomorrow someone says, okay, what you thought was reality is completely wrong, then I will have to embrace that.
Right.
If
right.
it's,
Yes.
if that argument.
Yeah. No, that's an interesting point, because, you know, I guess when you say the answer to the question, what is reality, is what really matters, I have to confess that there is a sense in which, to me, it isn't what really matters. And this is partly because I have no answer to the question. I don't know what reality is. I don't expect to know before I kick the bucket. I rather doubt, as a matter of fact, that anybody will ever know what reality is. And I don't even just confine that to human beings. I don't think there will ever be, I tend not to think that there will ever be an intelligent species anywhere in the universe which will finally achieve a real understanding of what reality is. So given that pessimistic, I suppose you could call it, view about the possibility of understanding reality, to me, it's more important that we preserve the possibility and the inclination to simply investigate and try to enhance our little bits and pieces of understanding of different parts of reality. That's sort of all that I regard as achievable, and so I want to maximize the likelihood that that will be preserved, that we can always continue to do that, can always continue to inquire further and improve our understanding of reality, but with the understanding that we will never achieve the final goal. And that's why in the heyday of the theories of everything that my fellow physicists were trying to generate, of course, they didn't really mean everything. They meant everything that they regarded as physically fundamental. But even that struck me as a pie-in-the-sky dreaming, and the enthusiasm seems to have gone out of that enterprise. So I'm more, I guess in a sense, I'm more pragmatic in that respect of doubting that we could ever achieve real understanding of the nature of reality. That'll always be a sort of a big question mark, I think. But we got to press on. We got to press on.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. I'm very much enjoying our conversations, Gordon. Every
yes.
fortnight, I think.
Yeah, they're very vigorous.
And they treat so many different topics, right?
Yes, right.
So no, I just want to thank you again for this evening, and it must be getting quite late in your time. And
it's approaching 7. I'll be making dinner and getting some dinner in a few minutes.
So we can certainly.
Yeah, it's very enjoyable. See you in 2 weeks.
Thank you so much, Gordon. You have a wonderful evening. Bye for now.